There's big news in the Middle East. Welcome back to True East, where we go behind the headlines and into the most important happenings in the region that impact Israel and the United States. Today, we're looking at a potential tipping point. According to satellite imagery and foreign reports, the United States has deployed B-2 Spirit stealth bombers to Diego Garcia, a remote but strategically critical U.S. airbase in the Indian Ocean, well out of Iran's missile range, but close enough to strike deep into its territory. This is not routine. This is a message, a serious one. The B-2s are capable of carrying 40,000-pound GBU-57 bunker busters, which are designed to obliterate underground nuclear facilities or even deeply fortified command centers. And just as those images were surfacing, President Donald Trump made headlines of his own. Speaking to NBC, he said, "If they don't make a deal, there will be a bombing. It will be bombing the likes of which they have never seen before." Tehran heard it loud and clear, and in a rare ominous threat, Iranian officials warned that any base launching attacks on Iran, whether manned by American, British, or Allied forces, will be treated as a legitimate target. Diego Garcia is now in their crosshairs. With this powder keg in mind, we're joined by someone uniquely positioned to help us make sense of what might happen next. It is my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Conricus. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus is a globally recognized expert in Middle Eastern security. He is a senior fellow at FDD and one of the most respected voices on Israel's evolving military posture. He served for over 20 years in the IDF, operating in the field, inside military intelligence, and later as the international spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces. Jonathan has seen the full spectrum of Israeli defense challenges and has responded to many of them firsthand. He's briefed world leaders, spoken to the media on the front lines, and navigated the complex intersection of diplomacy, deterrence, and war. For full disclosure, Jonathan was my commander in the Army for 4 years, and we served together from October 7th for the first 100 days of the war. I'm a big fan of Jonathan, I look up to Jonathan, and I am honored to have him with us. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Doron. The appreciation is mutual. I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to having this conversation with you. I think this is a really good place to have such a conversation that hopefully will go deep and wide and give people a perspective that they don't hear in other types of media, based on realities on the ground, no politics, no nonsense, very little fluff, but just a security analysis of a very dynamic situation.
One that's changing even as we speak.
It is.
So, Jonathan, I want to give you a scenario which is no longer really a scenario. It's something that's looking more and more likely to happen. The U.S. has been bombing Houthi targets in Yemen.
Yep.
Just yesterday, we've heard President Trump's remarks. We've heard the Iranian president refusing to negotiate. And now the United States has moved the Spirit stealth bombers to the island, as we can see on the screen behind us, to Diego Garcia.
Yep.
Which is just 3,000 miles from Iran. And these are meant to carry out, you don't just send a B-2 bomber into the air, they are meant to carry out a deeply penetrating attack. In this type of evolving situation, the likes of which I don't remember, what do you think is the next move?
First of all, I think it's important to have people know that I think we are still within the boundaries of negotiations. I don't think that the US or Iran have decided to break that equation and to venture into the realm of actual kinetic operations, to use military assets and to fight physically on the battlefield. I think that especially the US, there's still a few layers or a few milestones, diplomatic milestones for the US to go through, motions to go through, until we reach a time where that will be necessary and possible and the right thing to do, to use those bombers. If you ask me, we passed those milestones a long time ago. We've been doing diplomacy, sanctions and condemnations for the better part of 15, 20 years against Iran. And today, Iran is rushing towards weaponizing. They're no longer only enriching nuclear material. They've passed that milestone and they have that covered. It's no longer about enrichment. They have all the enriched material that they need. Now it's about weaponizing and really turning what they have into a functioning bomb, which, according to Israeli intel and American intel, is what the Iranians are busy doing now. And both sides, when I say both, I mean US, and a certain part of that is Israel, and then Iran on the other side. Both sides are posturing and signaling to the other side what the cost would be if we don't agree to a certain deal that doesn't necessitate the use of force. Now, what this move means is stepping up in terms of the intensity of the threat, and it's basically the US saying that there is a viable military option. It's on the table, and if we don't make good, solid progress right now, then that military option comes much closer to front and center, and the chances of using it are elevating. Now, the Iranians have had so much time, so many off-ramps, so many opportunities to choose a different path, but each time that they were presented with the dilemma, what does the Iranian regime do? Do they focus on prosperity? Do they focus on nation building? Do they focus on the future of the Iranian people? Or do they focus on achieving nuclear weapons and strengthening the regime? Each and every time that dilemma has been presented, the regime has chosen nuclear and has chosen the regime over the Iranian people. And the situation today in Iran is bad and getting worse by the day. Their currency reached a grim milestone of one Iranian rial to one US dollar to 1 million Iranian rial. It was 70 when the Iranian revolution started and when Khomeini and his mullahs took over Iran. And that type of management has really driven the country of Iran, rich in resources, rich in human capital and potential, vast in land and terrain. It has driven that country down the drain because the priority has been nuclear weapons, extremism, terrorism, and what they call the expansion of their Islamist revolution. So where we are now, bottom line, the stakes are higher. We are closer to using, the US is closer to using a military tool. And I think that it's really only a question of time before that or some other military tool becomes reality. I, as an Israeli, think that the likelihood, it is much more likely that Israel will find the courage and the tools necessary and actually go and do what needs to be done. I'm not entirely sure that the US is willing, politically, capable definitely, military speaking, but is the US willing to do so politically? Still unclear. But I think that Israel has, first and foremost, necessity. Israel has to take action because otherwise Iran will develop nuclear weapons and then they will have that giant nuclear umbrella to extend above all of their proxy terror organizations, those who remain and those that they will build in the future. And that will be a tremendous strategic challenge and a real existential threat for Israel. So Israel has the motivation, Israel has the tools. I think Israel is still waiting for the US to exhaust the process, the diplomatic process. Once that will be done, Israel will be faced with the reality of having the necessity to take action. And if you ask me, that is what Israel will do, hopefully not by itself.
So if I look at the map and we're looking at, there's a 3,000-mile distance from Diego to Iran.
Yep.
And we can see from Iran to Jordan, Israel's kind of actually ironically missing on our map here.
Yeah.
There's something in between which is called Saudi Arabia,
yep.
right? For our viewers, Riyadh and all this large landmass is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran had a surprising reconciliation, a degree of reconciliation that was carried out very recently, of all places in China.
Yeah.
But it was done. How do you see Saudi responding if Israel has to go through their airspace to attack Iran?
Yeah, that's an if, because I think what Israel has done with a lot of strategic foresight over the last months is to blast a path, basically clear an aerial path that doesn't necessitate the use of Saudi airspace. And what Israel did a few months back when HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, took control over Syria and unseated the Syrian dictator, a few days after that, Israel launched a strategic operation, very good one, very clean and very precise, where Israel took out almost all of the air defenses, I'd say all air defenses in Syria, and almost all of their strategic weapons and research and development facilities, but more to the point, air defenses. So today, if Israel needs to carry out operations above Iranian airspace, then Israel has the ability, according to my understanding, to do so with relative ease. Nothing is easy when you're flying in the Middle East, but relative ease in order to get to where they need to go. Iraq doesn't have a lot of air defenses, if at all, and once Syria isn't much of a threat, then that paves the way for Israeli planes to go in. Israel has the capability, fifth generation aircraft, the F-35Is, with the ability to penetrate and open up a path, and then other aircraft, 15s mostly, to deliver the ordnance. And then, of course, the dilemma, and I think you're very correct in speaking about Saudi, because the Saudis will be at kind of a dilemma when we look at tactical operations and the current military situation, but also when we draw the connection between that and the bigger geopolitical situation in the Middle East. We know, based on various reports, many of them I think very credible, that there is a deal in the works. It has been in the works for years. October 7, Hamas's assault on Israel sidelined that or derailed it. But the deal to be made is one of mutual recognition between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the State of Israel, an expansion, a dramatic and very important and futurely prosperous expansion of the Abraham Accords, and to build that bridge between the Saudis and Israel. The dilemma for the Saudis will be, will they allow Israel to use Saudi airspace as part of operations? Interesting question. I think they will probably defer to the very last minute until they commit to something like that. And I think Israel will use creative ways in order to have various other options so that we won't have to rely on Saudi airspace. But what I think is more important is, where will it lead in the future, right? Whatever happens between Israel and Iran, long-term politically speaking, Israel definitely wants to expand the Abraham Accords. Israel wants to solidify its diplomatic ties in the region. Israel wants to build bridges. Israel wants to improve its prosperity, but also be a kind of a generator for regional prosperity. And this, by the way, I think transcends U.S. partisan politics as well, because former President Biden, when he was here, he signed the Jerusalem Declaration. The Jerusalem Declaration is all about expanding peace in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Israel, linking that up to Southeast Asia, and having this area of the world, the Arabian Peninsula and the Israeli coast with Jordan in the middle also benefiting from it, as a gateway to Europe, as a gateway to the West for energy, for communications, for commerce. Many beautiful things can, and I hope will happen once that turns into reality, and hopefully we'll have both sides of the aisle in the US, in Congress, supporting it and working for it. It's good for US interests, it's good for Saudi, and from my perspective, very good for Israeli interests.
Very interesting. So you're basically, if I understand correctly, saying that there's almost like a line being drawn in the sand right now within Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Arabia is positioning itself, it's now made some type of accommodation with Iran, possibly, yet it is looking towards the Abraham Accords, which is being pushed by the United States. And I guess there's a lot on the table right now, depending how Saudi Arabia will look at Israel and the United States in terms of dealing with Iran. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that the Saudi deal or rapprochement with the Iranians was much more signaling. I interpret it as signaling to the US that if you don't own up to being the world's most important superpower, a force for good, for order, and for a value-based, law and order-based global order. If you don't do that, then we are going to look for other options, and the other option is China. We need security guarantees. We want strategic and military guarantees, and if they're not provided by the US, then we will look elsewhere. And I think that the Saudis were okay with doing that, and the Chinese were definitely very happy to, poke the US in the eye. But I think that at the end of the day, it really boils down to how truthful and how energetic will the US be in reestablishing itself in the region, in making sure that its allies know that the US can be trusted and that the US will provide security guarantees. I think if the Saudis are really convinced of that, then the margin or the area of dilemma for the Saudis, whether or not to go into the Abraham Accords, will be so much smaller, and I think that'll be very positive. I think it would be convenient not to speak about it, but I think it wouldn't be professional. We have to mention the whole Palestinian issue, the insistence of many Arab countries for 76 years to condition recognition of Israel and peace and prosperity with a two-state solution or any type of political solution to the Palestinian conflict. I think that's the biggest dilemma, sadly, that the Saudis will have to deal with. And here they'll have to choose between their own strategic interests and their own future, stability, access to security guarantees from the US, deterrence against Iran, whatever will be left of the Iranian regime, and on the other hand, virtue signaling and still supporting a losing cause that has had so many opportunities to do right and so many opportunities to reach peace, but each time the Palestinians chose not to. And up until now, they've had almost automatic support from Arab countries. I think that's changing, and I think October 7, before and after October 7, was a very big watershed moment also in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because today many people understand, even though they're perhaps not courageous enough to acknowledge it, but many people understand that the voice that most authentically represents the Palestinian mindset is the voice of Hamas. It is the voice of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that is based on what Palestinians are saying in Palestinian polls, what they say and the kind of political views that they espouse in poll after poll, election or semi-election after semi-election. And the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, all of the other Arab countries, they know that the Muslim Brotherhood is trouble. And once Palestinian society has gone that hardline extreme way, I think what that needs to do is to make the dilemma easier for the Saudis to say, okay, this so-called cause that we've allowed it to condition development and prosperity in the Middle East, we don't need to continue to babysit this anymore. And if they don't want peace, if they're going towards the way of jihad and the way of war against Israel and sacrifice and blood and terror, that's their choice. We, the Saudis, shouldn't hinge our future on that. And I think we're going into that direction. We're perhaps not there yet, but I hope we will be going into that direction. And I hope that the Saudis will be able to make a good decision for themselves, not for Palestinians and not for Israel. A good, sound, logical decision for themselves.
So, Jonathan, there's a lot that's on the table right now. We've got the Palestinian situation and the way Saudi Arabia looks at that, and also the complication or the interesting part that it is clear today, obviously to Saudi Arabia, but to the rest of the world, that Iran has been financing Hamas and that Iran was very much part of the architect of October 7th. Saudi Arabia knows this and the Arab world knows this. They also see the massive change that's taken place throughout the Middle East because of Iran's tentacles that are spreading throughout this region. What would it take? And President Trump did say that there was an option for tariffs or for a blockade, depending on what choice Iran goes for. It's not necessarily a fait accompli for a military attack on Iran. What would it require Iran to do in order for the U.S. to say, okay, we're not going to launch our B-2 stealth bombers to attack, and we're not going to have Israel attack Iran?
Yeah. So I think there's interesting developments here as well, because for many years, basically 15 years, the whole nuclear discussion was about enrichment, right? At what level, what percentage? Is it 60%, 62, 90%? Is it weapons grade enrichment? And a lot of technical terms. But lots of people who understand nuclear physics and lots of people who don't, myself included, we spoke about enrichment. That is a conversation of the past. That's a milestone that is no longer relevant because the Iranians, through perseverance, focus and priority, and ingenuity and sacrifice throughout many years, have stayed their course, and they have enhanced their enrichment capabilities with new and very powerful and fast-working enrichment centrifuges. They've been able to basically overcome that issue, and today they have enough enriched material for at least 5 bombs and the ability to do more and faster. So that isn't the issue anymore. Why is that relevant? Why do I speak of that? Because in the past, international intervention was about inspecting those enrichment sites. Today, what we have to be looking at are all of the various sites in Iran where they may be conducting weaponization, where they may be doing experiments in advanced metals, detonating mechanisms, where they will be fusing everything together into warheads, where they connect a warhead to a ballistic missile. And all, that is where the conversation is now. And I think it was a positive milestone to hear President Trump and also I think it was Waltz who spoke about it, National Security Advisor, who spoke about the need to inspect each and every location in Iran that is remotely related to their nuclear program and to disarm. Not only inspect, but to have a full and complete disarmament of what they've been able to produce so far and the infrastructure that the Iranian regime used in order to produce these capabilities. That's where we are now. And I think if the Iranians today understand that they're facing a real serious dilemma where there's a real tangible military option on the table and there's a political will to use it, Israel or the US or both, if they understand that that is where they are and that they have one out of 2 options, what they need to do in order to save themselves, save their future and perhaps their regime, is to abide by a very comprehensive and deep exposure of everything related to their nuclear research and weaponization. So that means full access for international observers to anything and everything related to nuclear. Enrichment, yes, various facilities, but also beyond that. Everything where all of the locations where they do studies and research and experimenting with things that are related to actually building a bomb, that could maybe prevent or render unnecessary military action. Even then, I think that there are still questions because, we've been there in the past. The Iranians have been they've been exposed as consistent liars. They have lied, falsified, and distorted almost everything throughout this process of 15, 20 years. And what they've basically tried to do is to buy time by sowing confusion, getting in between the different stakeholders, the US and the 3 European countries that have been negotiating about it, and finding the fault lines between those countries and getting in between in order to delay and give themselves enough time to first enrich and then weaponize. So there's definitely not a lot of trust. So I don't know, even if the remote chance happens and Khamenei understands that this is the only way that Israel and the US don't attack Iran, and he says, okay, I agree, you can inspect everywhere, and you can do whatever is necessary to prove that we don't have nuclear weapons. Not entirely sure that that will make it because of how much the Iranians have lied and distorted and falsified in the past. But I think it would be a very good start.
I want to ask you a different scenario for 1 second. We can't know as great as our intelligence is and U.S. intelligence, if we make an assumption that perhaps there are some things we cannot calculate.
Which we should,
right? That's part of the mistake that was on October 7th. There's a black hole always in intelligence.
I think it was one of the former American vice presidents who spoke of unknown unknowns.
Correct, exactly. So if there's an unknown right now in Iran, is it not possible that maybe within a series of days, or perhaps it's already happened, that Iran has a nuclear weapon that is already armed and possibly in use, possibly is able to be used, is ready to be used? And if they go public in that announcement and they said, we are now nuclear capable, do you see that changing the scenario with the U.S., how the U.S. and Israel would treat Iran?
That will definitely speed up the decision process, and that will definitely force Israeli and American, and to some extent European, but mostly Israeli and American decision makers to make a historic decision and to make it fast. I'm sure that if the Iranians were to say such a thing, their aim would, of course, be to insinuate that if you attack us, then we will use it. That may be a bluff, and it may be a real move. There will only be one way to find out. We don't know. I don't know. And I don't know if our intel communities and the people who have access to that level of intel, if they know. And I think the healthy way is the healthy and the correct way in this business is to be very suspicious of your enemy, respectful of your enemy, always assume that the enemy is cunning, strategic, and masterful at deceiving. All of these things are true about the Iranians. I think they have shown to be very cunning, clever, and strategic in their dealings. The fact that some of the most powerful countries in the world have opposed and stated time and again that they won't allow Iran to achieve nuclear military capabilities, yet still here we are. We are just around the corner from a nuclear Iran, despite 15, 20 years of sanctions and diplomacy. So all credit to the Iranian regime for doing that. And I think we should treat them with respect and caution. And then, of course, be very firm and clear about what we are going to do. And that is to make sure that it doesn't happen. Now, here again, it's not a political issue, really. This is not a division in the U.S. between Democrats and Republicans. We have 3 U.S. presidents, 2 of them Democrats, and 1 of them Republican, who have said clearly on record, one of them in writing, President Biden, that President Biden in the Jerusalem Declaration said that the U.S. will use all the means of its national power to prevent Iran from going nuclear. President Obama said it, and President Trump has reiterated and confirmed it. So this shouldn't be a political issue. This really is an issue of security, stability, and for Israel, it's a matter of existence. For the U.S., it's a matter of national security. For the region and the world, it's a matter of stability and national security. I think all the interests around the world align, of the free world, to stop the Iranian regime from achieving these apocalyptic nuclear capabilities. And I hope that the world would do that.
If it would have a nuclear weapon, again, I'm going back to this because as the Iranian regime is weakened, like you say, the Iranian currency has lost so much of its value. Only in the last year, it lost another 50% of its value. Since the start of the war with Israel. We can see perhaps civil unrest beginning, and that can also be, to some degree, expedited by other countries around the world if they would contribute to this, both the U.S. and Israel. If the regime sees itself seriously weakened, then it could either wage a threat of a nuclear weapon, or, God forbid, perhaps shoot a nuclear weapon. If it would fire a nuclear weapon, if such a thing could happen, again, if it's a scenario that could play out, where would that go?
Well, I think Israel has shown that's, of course, a scenario that goes a few steps, a few escalatory steps into the future. I think Israel has shown, together with its allies, first and foremost the U.S., a very good capacity to defend its airspace against incoming missiles, and that's super important. Again, joint US-Israeli weapons development, missile defense, just a proof of how of an excellent investment that has been on behalf of the US and Israel to develop the David Sling, to develop the Arrow together. These are stabilizing weapon systems that have allowed Israeli and American decision makers much more time to make calm and logical decisions and not have to respond to a catastrophe on the ground since Iranian missiles rained down on Israel and weren't able to be intercepted. So one, we have air defenses. They may be able to shoot whatever it is, shoot it out of the sky. I spoke about this on an interview just a few days ago on X, where it's important to understand what our enemies think. Israel has a long-standing policy of being ambiguous about its military capabilities, specifically whether or not it has nuclear weapons. And I think it's important to try to listen to what our enemies understand that we have. I think the common understanding amongst our enemies is that not only does Israel have nuclear capabilities, but Israel also has second strike nuclear capabilities, which is very important in terms of deterrence, because it makes sure that our enemies understand that even if they are crazy enough, reckless enough, and suicidal enough to fire and to use such a horrible weapon of mass destruction against Israel, even if it would strike in Israel, Israel would still have the ability to make sure that far worse things happen to whoever fired that missile at Israel, missile or missiles at Israel. And that is, of course, very important when it comes to deterrence. So I think that's part of the calculation. But, I wouldn't want to be in that scenario, of course, anyhow. And I wouldn't want to be in a scenario where any enemy country has that ability to flex a nuclear umbrella. Imagine a scenario of October 7, 1 or 2 Iranian proxies invade into Israel, butcher, rape, burn, pillage, take hostages. Israel prepares to defend itself by attacking the enemy. And then the Iranians open their nuclear umbrella and say, well, if you do that, we will see that as, and they'll make up some excuse, an attack on Muslims, and we see ourselves as the defenders of Muslim faith or holy lands or whatever pretext they'll use. And if you do, we will use the tools available. And that could force Israel into a very inconvenient geopolitical situation, regardless of which administration is in the White House. And that's an area where we don't want to be. And it should be prevented.
If you and I are sitting here in 1 year and the US decide and Israel decide not to strike Iran.
Yeah.
And there's some type of inspection policy that goes on, and we can assume, as you've said, that the Iranians would allow some inspections, perhaps. They're not going to allow all of them. They'll begin to delay. If we have the same conversation in a year, do you think that the nuclear threat coming from Iran will be different? That by that time, they will have the capacity to...
Based on all the information that I've seen from credible Israeli sources and what I've listened to from US officials, we don't have a year. We don't have a year. And if we sit here in a year and talk about inspections in Iran, then we probably missed the train, and we're in a totally different environment, not in a good way. I think that we are very close to decision time. I think that many years of diplomacy have passed, many years of sanctions on and off that have had certain effects and then no effects and then effects again on the Iranian economy. They have passed, and we still have not achieved, the world hasn't achieved what it wants to do, and that is to prevent this crazy, extremist, totalitarian regime from having apocalyptic weapons of mass destruction. So if we sit here in a year and debate it, that will not be a good sign. I think that in the coming weeks is when we will see action. I think it will be done by Israel. I think it will be done with US support, indirect support, but there will be US support, because I don't see any other way. I see the Iranian regime hell-bent on achieving these capabilities. They are too far into the game, and they have vested so much of the prestige of the regime, the assets, and so many Iranians have suffered for it, that I think that they're going to go all in, even if it is absolutely the worst thing for the Iranians to do. And I regret that. But I think that at the end of the day, Israel has shown that it has the capacity through our Air Force and Special Forces and Mossad, and it has the political will to do what it needs to do in order to defend itself. And this is a possible existential threat to the state of Israel, and as such, Israel is forced to take action. And I don't think that we have a year.
Jonathan, you're basically painting a very clear picture of brinkmanship, that I guess the introduction of the Trump administration is that it has accelerated the brinkmanship between the U.S. and Israel and Iran, where at this point in time, based on the U.S.'s insistence on what it's asking to do, to inspect every single site, and the likelihood that Iran will refuse to walk back their nuclear program, and now that there's kind of teeth in the deal, we're looking at some decision in the next few weeks. I want to bring us to the eventuality that a strike takes place. And if there's a strike that takes place, most likely Iran has said that it would target U.S. and British assets that are involved, but I'm also assuming it would target Israeli assets. We've seen waves of 500 missiles and suicide drones come from Iran. What could a possible response from Iran towards Israel look like in that scenario, putting aside any nuclear capabilities whatsoever?
Yeah. So, based on the assessments that I'm aware of, it would be more of the same. It's always wise to assume that the enemy has additional capabilities and strategic surprises that we're not aware of, that it hasn't exposed yet, and we haven't yet seen on the battlefield. But I think currently what Iran did twice when they attacked Israel was to use massive reliance on standoff capabilities, so drones, rockets and missiles that they fired from afar, and they enjoyed very limited success in terms of striking their intended targets in Israel. Almost no casualties and extremely limited damage to any infrastructure of importance in Israel. I might have said different things if the second Iranian strike had been different from the first, but it really wasn't. It was just more of the same. More missiles fired in a shorter time frame against less targets, so they had more missiles per target. I think that it would be something similar.
Could you see Hezbollah entering the framework here to try to overwhelm Israel's defense? They still have capability.
They have significant capabilities, but I think that that is, by the way, a very big difference. And, the whole history the whole balance of power in the Middle East has changed as a result of Hamas's attack on October 7. Before that, when Hezbollah was still intact, when Hassan Nasrallah, his supreme military command, military headquarters, and when the Radwan unit were still intact, they held significant deterrence over Israel in preventing Israel from doing anything against Iran's nuclear facilities or against the Iranian regime. Why? Because 150,000 rockets were aimed at Israel from Hezbollah. And I know, based on my conversations with Israeli decision makers, military and elected officials, that deterrence was real and effective. It prevented Israel from taking action that, in my mind and many other people's minds, it should have taken a long time ago. That is now very different. It's not out of the equation, but Hezbollah today is a very pale shadow of what it was before October 7. They're suffering from significant issues. They've been defeated on the battlefield. Most of their leadership has been decimated. They are suffering politically in Lebanon, and they're in the worst position locally that they've been in the last 20 years. These are not things to be taken lightly for Hezbollah, and perhaps most importantly, they have a serious issue of logistics. They currently do not have the ability to make sure that they have heavy supplies provided by Iran through Iraq and then Syria into Lebanon. Why? Because the Syrian dictator fell, and the current landlords in Syria are not positively inclined towards Hezbollah or towards the Iranians. That presents a significant problem for Hezbollah, because they know that anything that they will shoot today will leave a gap in their arsenals because they currently do not have a industrial way
to replenish
what they fire. And that's an important calculation. And Hezbollah is an organization that I think thinks long term. And I don't think that they would really jeopardize their very existence by getting involved in such a thing. Now, what it really boils down to, and I think another point that's really interesting to think about is, can the Iranian regime survive a strike on its nuclear facilities? Can it survive that in terms of humiliation, in terms of what it would mean for their prestige? And how would the Iranian street respond? The everyday people who I'm sure won't be happy that a foreign country is invading its airspace and dropping bombs, but maybe they will see it as an option or an opportunity to get rid of the Iranian regime, which has been controlling and oppressing the Iranian people since 1979. That's why there's more to it. This isn't only about nuclear weapons. That is definitely front and center and topic number one. That's the regional menace, and that is what Israel and the US and the West need to deal with. But there's more at stake here, and that's why things are so tense, because this could mean the end or the undoing of, it could be the final domino of the Iranian regime. The first domino that fell was Hamas. When they launched the attack on Israel on October the 7th, subsequently pushed back and defeated by Israel, Hezbollah were dealt a severe blow, and the Iranians exposed themselves for less than what we thought they were. If there's now military action against their nuclear program, that could really jeopardize the regime. And I think that is why things are so tense, and that is why I think we're seeing lots of signals of distress from the Iranian regime, because there is a lot at stake.
Have you heard contingency plans for, if there is a strike on Iran and there's destabilization, a way for the citizens, the civilians in Iran to act against the government? I mean, what we've seen in the past 2 years is they've stood up when the woman had uncovered her hair and they had killed her.
Yes, women, life, freedom.
Yeah. Exactly. And they stood up and they were, mowed down in the streets with incredible bravery and courage. They came out with wooden clubs against, the Iranian force with the assault rifles. Is there a contingency plan for doing this? Have you heard it spoken about?
I have. First of all, I think, change in any society only comes from within. And I think that the Iranian people, women and men, have proven themselves to be very brave. I think that around the world, there are so many examples of brave Iranian patriots in the US, in Germany, in France, in Canada, Australia. Almost wherever I go, I meet very brave, very intelligent, very well-spoken, very proud Iranian patriots who have been forced out of their country by this extremist regime. They, by the way, long to get back to their home country and to reclaim their country from the hands of crazy jihadists who have taken control over it. Real change comes from within, and I think that I am aware of contingencies. I'm aware of various countries and organizations who think about these things and plan and have certain involvement. But whatever various external forces will do, really what matters is what the Iranian people will decide to do. And what the current the Islamic regime has done is to decimate any type of political structure in Iran, to make it impossible for there to be a parallel option or any type of functioning political organization that could pose a threat towards the regime. So there are no trade organizations, there are no Boy Scouts, there are no other youth movements, and there's no professional structures or organizations. There are no unions. Why? Because those political organizations are a threat, or could be perceived or could be used as a threat against the regime, and they simply haven't allowed it. So that is a challenge. We have the challenge of communications. We have the challenge of force, actual weapons and money. And without going into too many details, I can say that each and every of those topics are being planned and there are contingencies for those various issues in order to help those in Iran, the people in Iran, to stand up against the regime.
Jonathan, I want to ask you about one last thing, which is hope. As seeing you on the TV, often in the same room as you, and you projected throughout the early days of this war, I think for all of us, you set the tone of projecting confidence and courage and hope. Even on October 7th, when we started together, and the 8th and 9th and 10th, the darkest days of the Jewish and Israeli history, at least in my memory and probably in yours.
Definitely.
Give us a message right now of hope, seeing that the hourglass has been flipped over and the sand is falling and we realize what's on the table and it may happen soon. What would you say to an 18-year-old Israeli who's thinking about living their lives here?
Well, I'd say what I tell my kids who happen to be 18 years old, two of them. And I'll say that, when it boils down to the bottom line, this is our ancestral homeland. It has always been contested. Never in history has it been easy, peaceful, and in lovely neighborly relations. You know that extremely well from your background at Ir David, and you've documented it in your book. And I think that our story is, unfortunately, a story of battle and of other people who are trying to chase us out of our homeland. I am hopeful about the future, even though many mistakes have been made, even though I have a lot to say about the decision-making process in Israel, and I have a lot to say about our political leadership. I think many horrible mistakes have been made and are being made as we speak. Despite that, I am hopeful about the future. One main reason is exactly the people you spoke about, the 18-year-olds, the young in Israel, who despite being perceived by others before that, by older generations, as a lesser generation.
The TikTok generation,
yes,
as they called them, demeaningly.
Exactly, demeaningly and wrongly so. What we see today on the battlefield, in civil society, across all Israel, by the way, Jews, Druze, Christians, some Bedouins, we see that across civil society as well, is wherever there's a lacuna, wherever there's a shortcoming of the government and of the official institutions, people have stepped up. They did it on October the 7th. You remember how, we looked left and right and we saw that our organization that we so proudly represented, the IDF, we failed. But we saw that once we were able to push back and reestablish control of the border, the ones who came forward were civilians, civil organizations, volunteers, families, etc. And at the end of the day, I think we have one tremendous advantage over our enemies, and that is the quality, the commitment, and the bond and the strength of our people. And I think that we're in for challenging times. I think we're going to have a few rough years economically, maybe militarily. But at the end of it, I think we will come out stronger than we were before October 7th. I hope that we will have a different type of leadership that will harness the positive forces in Israeli society, Jews and non-Jews alike, rally them around positive notions of respect, of prosperity, of identity, and then move forward in a democratic and Jewish way into prosperity, and to really use the beautiful forces and energy that we have in Israel, and not to enhance the differences and the differences and the other opinions that we have in society, but really to move forward, creating a more unified story. If we do that, then I think we have a beautiful future. Never mind, or regardless of the stormy waters around us, we'll be able to overcome those. But our strength is in the future generation, their belief and connection to the land and to the country, to the state. And I think that I am hopeful that that will be the case. And I'm also hopeful that we'll be able to weather the storm and come out stronger than we were before.
Jonathan Conricus, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, my dear friend, thank you so much for your incredible military insights, your knowledge, your ability to combine really the sweep of Jewish history, both in terms of the moral and the Jewish elements that have guided our nation for so long, and also the current military elements to provide a message of hope and courage. And you should be successful in everything you do. Thank you so much for joining True East. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining True East. Again, just tune in next week, and we look forward to bringing you all the relevant news on Israel in the Middle East. Thank you for joining.